that nationalism was often seen as pathological, as diseased, as aggressive toward others, especially after the Nazi regime also used that word, nationalism, National Socialism. Well, we know as Jews that nationalism is a neutral tool. In the 1940s, we experienced nationalism at its worst, at its most toxic, at its most evil, at its most lethal during the Shoah. And in 1948, we celebrated nationalism at its most expansive, at its most liberating. In both my professional identities, as an American historian and as a Zionist, I cannot explain either the miracle of America or the miracle of Israel without using the word nationalism. And Isaiah Berlin said, in the Jewish case, all I mean is awareness of oneself as a community possessing internal bonds, which don't make us better or worse than anybody else, but just connect us, give us a common language. Remember when we used to travel and we'd bump into somebody who also was Jewish and we bageled them or they bageled us? We didn't get all arrogant to say, oh, we're so much better than everybody else, but we had a common language. When Israelis bump into one another, we call that kremboing. And when we actually sit down and have an intense conversation, it's not just bageling, which is superficial, or kremboing, I call it sedering. Where you can sit down with a fellow Jew and just over coffee, over a meal, over a few words, find all kinds of common links, common ideas, common values. And that's the thing I really want to be thinking about. And when I'm speaking especially to younger folks in college who are struggling with who am I try to bring them into a conversation about identity and some of the glue, some of the ties that bond. And one of the things that helps me a lot is an interesting article written by the cultural anthropologist Richard Schweder, who talks about 3 dimensions to ethics, to ethical human beings: autonomy, community, and divinity or sanctity. And there's a great book by Jonathan Haidt. And he tells the story. Jonathan Haidt is a professor now at NYU. And he tells the story about it being a good, he doesn't call himself a Jew, but he's a Jewish liberal. He calls himself a liberal atheist who's at University of Pennsylvania studying cultural anthropology. And he goes off to India to learn more about his advisor, Richard Schweder, Richard Schweder's teaching. Richard Schweder is from the University of Chicago, and Haidt had been at the University of Pennsylvania and spends a year at the University of Chicago and then goes off to India. I have to get that right for Eitan, who's a University of Chicago graduate. And Haidt's in India. And he says, you know, I fancy myself as open-minded, but I actually start realizing how closed-minded I am because I'm appalled, I'm disgusted by all those rituals that these Indians are doing. They're sexist, they're very primitive, there's a lot of dirt around, and he's finding himself put off. But the more he goes into things, the more he realizes, he keeps on going back to Schweder's ideas. And he understands that autonomy, the ani, the I, the self, was the central ethic, the central vision, the central message that he got growing up as a good liberal American. Me, my, more, now. And he starts looking at his Indian hosts' rituals because he says, I like them and they're kind to me. And so even though I'm put off, I'm trying to understand them. And all of a sudden he realizes that many of the rituals they're engaging in are rituals that build up community, build up connectedness, build up not just autonomy, the I, but the us. And he says others of them build up elokut, divinity, sanctity. And from there, he builds, in his extraordinary book, The Righteous Mind, a more elaborate system of care and fairness and loyalty. But for our terms, I really want to stick to the 3 of autonomy, community, and divinity or sanctity, and argue that those are the dimensions that help us understand the power of Jewish peoplehood. And let me stop and be very clear. As I said with bageling, I'm not saying we're better or worse than anybody else. All I'm saying is that this is my way, and this is our conversation. And those props, that sense of autonomy, that sense of community, that sense of sanctity, can be things that lead down the path of negativity and closed-mindedness and xenophobia. But they also can be ideas that help us soar and help us fly and help us achieve something greater than the self. And that's the power of the liberal nationalism that I know and love, of the expansive nationalism that I know and love. It's not a nationalism, it's not a peoplehood that builds up walls. It's a nationalism, it's a peoplehood that opens up ideas and helps us soar. And the image for me is a bird, an eagle, if you will. And you know, if the eagle tries to stay in place, it plummets. But if it flaps its wings, its right wing and its left wing, its religious wing and its secular wing, and is always stretching and aspiring to something, then we understand American nationalism, Israeli nationalism, American peoplehood, Israeli peoplehood. Does that mean we're perfect? No, but we're always striving for something. And when we go back to South Africa, you know, we have at least one South African on the call, and I'm visiting South Africa, and we're at the Apartheid Museum in Johannesburg. When you get to the Nelson Mandela exhibit, we see this quote from Aristotle: good moral character is not something we can achieve on our own. We need a culture that supports the conditions under which self-love and friendship can flourish. Sharansky, Mandela said the same thing. Until I knew who I was, until I was rooted in my own story, my own people, my own land, my own self, my own identity, my own autonomy, I couldn't fight for human rights. But once I was there, I needed to connect to community and then to reach up for sanctity. And so now we go to our first text. And now the Zionist Salon, that was the introduction. The Zionist Salon begins. And again, we're trying to see, what are these glues? What are these ties that bind? And Theodor Herzl says, we are a people, one people. We shall live at last as free people on our own soil and in our own homes peacefully die. The world will be liberated by our freedom, enriched by our wealth, magnified by our greatness. What's going on here? Anybody want to respond to this text? Eitan, I'm going to ask you as moderator to pull people out. If anybody wants to respond, they can text or they can...
you can chat to me and I will unmute you.
But when we look at that, there's a move that's occurring. There's a dynamic that's occurring in that quote that's so important, that brings us to a different understanding of nationalism, of peoplehood, and of Theodor Herzl. Okay, I'll answer it. See, this is why I say Zoom, teaching on Zoom is like kissing through a handkerchief. That you don't have the same dynamic with students. You can't call on people, but I'll be very happy to have it more interactive, but I'm also very happy to kind of guide you through and then get questions afterwards. The move that Herzl is making and the undoing project that we have to do when we talk about Theodor Herzl is, too many of us read Theodor Herzl as a garrison Zionist, as a fortress Zionist, as an anti-Semite, and see Zionism purely as defensive. Yes, Theodor Herzl is traumatized by the Dreyfus trial and by anti-Semitism, but he also, from the start, if you read his diary, if you read his whole biography, is also rooted in a story of Jewish peoplehood. And here we see what I call the Jew-jitsu, J-E-W, from the negative to the positive. They do hate us, but we are a people for all kinds of other reasons. And we will use that peoplehood, we will use that nationalism to be an Or LaGoyim, a light unto others. Herzl himself, and when he put together the Zionist ideas, I tried to find one text that was just of a normal Zionist, who just said, you know what, I just want to be normal. The first half, I just want to live on our own soil and our own homes peacefully die. Every Zionist text I read ultimately, and almost every Jewish text I read ultimately, is also soaring, is aspirational, is trying to fix the world and fix the self. And that's the exciting thing about constructive liberal nationalism, aspirational nationalism, about our peoplehood. It's not static, it's dynamic. And it's seeking to make us better people and make the world a better place. And look, Theodor Herzl in the 1890s is already on the shoulders of giants. And of course, we could go all the way back to Avraham Avinu and the Torah, but we only have 3 hours for the Zoom call. Just kidding. Moses Hess in Roman Jerusalem writes in a way that is so modern, that is so tied to some of our current issues, that is such a zeroing in on one of the dynamics that's going on in, I'm sorry to say, modern American campuses, which is where I spend a lot of my time and a lot of my energy. And he too is using this nationality notion, this nationalism. And Moses Hess, of course, is the great philosopher who had been a socialist, flirted with Marx, and then they have a falling out, and he comes back to his Jewish roots. And he says, he looks at these Jews who deny their nationality, who think, oh, well, what can I do? I want to fit in, right? He might have a name like Gil Troy, which gets great reception at Greek restaurants, which is a name that was actually the result of a Troyansky-ectomy. My father was born Troyansky. His father was Troyanovsky, and who knows what was in the old country. I say Rashi is my great-great-great-great-grandfather, so he probably got the name Troy from Troy, France, Troyes. But he wanted to fit in, and so he did this Anskyectomy, and we became Troy. But he also wanted us to stand out, and he gave me the weirdo name of Gilad. And I can't tell you what a burden it was, even in Salon Schechter School of Queens, having the name Gilad, when all my buddies had normal names like James and Elliot and Richard. So I gave myself an adectomy, and I always called myself Gil Troy. And it means that I was a teaching assistant at Harvard, and the Revolutionary Transformation War, of course, on the American Revolutionary War. And Richard John comes up to Gil Troy. You know how WASPs, white Anglo-Saxon Protestants, have first names that are last names and last names that are first names. So Richard John says to me, oh, there are so few WASPs like us around nowadays, because Troy could be a first name too. And I put on my heaviest New York accent and say, even fewer than you think. But I loved that. I didn't experience that as anti-Semitism. It meant, hey, I fit in, I belong. And so I too flirted with being a dishonorable Jew, wanting to deny my nationality. In truth, I was actually playing this game. I was a proud Jew internally, but I also wanted to be an American. And that was the great gift that I'd gotten from my father. And I'd gotten from my grandparents who came to the new country, the new world. But look at what Hess says. He says, they cloak their treason behind beautiful phrases about humanity and enlightenment, but ultimately they fear being identified with their unfortunate brethren. They hide in vain. But you know what? You may mask yourself 1,000 times. You may travel through the world incognito. But at the end of the day, every insult to the Jewish name will strike you even more than the man who admits his Jewish loyalty and who fights for the honor of the Jewish name. And so he's saying, you know what? You can run, but you can't hide. And I too had my own coming out moment during the worst days of the Intifada, when I wrote an essay called Why I'm a Zionist, and stopped hiding behind my name, Gil Troy, as an American historian, and started becoming more of an active Zionist. And said to the world, during the worst days of the terrorism in 2001, 2002, I am a Jew. I am a Zionist. And that, of course, meant in the university I was called a racist as well. But notice what Hess does. Again, another jujitsu. I'm not just going to tell you, oh, be a Jew because you're going to feel badly about it. I want to invite you in to this tension that Herzl also manages. The national character of Judaism does not exclude universalism in modern civilization. On the contrary, these values are the logical effect of our national character. It nonetheless means that we have this national root of Judaism, and through that we become universal. And he says, just like, look, we have pretty flowers, and each flower has its own name and its own zan, its own species, but it also can give us universal joy and universal inspiration. And so we start with Herzl and Hess. We start with this notion of a Zionism and a peoplehood, which is aspirational, and that's part of the power of Never Alone. I'm going to stop for a moment and see if there are any questions, comments, or disagreements before I plunge ahead. Eitan, you're monitoring. I'm continuing.
I'm looking, not
Okay.
seeing.
Now, too much of the Zionist conversation, especially in the 21st century, is still rooted in anti-Semitism. I'm well aware of the ugliness of anti-Semitism, that it never disappears. And in our book, we obviously talk about it. Natan has done so much work in articulating the 3Ds: demonization, delegitimization, disproportionate hatred of the Jewish people, as ways of distinguishing between legitimate criticism of Israel and anti-Zionism that is truly anti-Semitic. But the Zionist conversation isn't only about anti-Semitism. And it's not only about universal ideals. It's also about a deeper question, and this goes back to our autonomy, our sanctity, our community of who am I? And one of the things I like to do when I work with people, old and young, is not take texts of 2020 necessarily. I like to show, especially young people, that many of these questions about assimilation and anti-Semitism, many of these questions of who am I, have been going on for 10, 20, 30, 50, 70, 100, 200 years. I never want to be that guy who starts waving my fingers at the young people going, you people, you're not so good. Look at us, we were so pure and perfect. I want to invite them in to my own identity conflicts. And that's why I share the story of Gil Troy. I liked fitting in, but I learned to stand out. And look at this extraordinary text by Anne Royfee, great American feminist, who writes a very controversial op-ed in the New York Times in the late 70s about how she enjoys, as a Jew, celebrating Christmas. And she's taken aback by the fury and the hatred that op-ed triggers, and it triggers her own Jewish journey. And she ends up writing this book, Generation Without Memory, in 1981. And she admits something very profound that is very true for many of my students today in 2020, almost 40 years later. Judaism and Jewish life in America often appears to be thinning. And she says, look at my own traditions. Again, I always look for people who are self-critical, not pointing the finger at others, but pointing the finger at the self. When I think of our own family traditions, they're eclectic, they're thin, they lack a certain magic or destiny. I think we made an error. I appreciate the Thanksgiving and Christmas that we made, and we'll have beautiful weddings for our daughters. But I believe we're missing something. The tensions of the ancient ways, the closeness of the primitive magic, that patina, that finishing of the ages, and the sense of the past and future that are lacking in lives. There's serious losses. We gave up something. And then a devastating line. A Judaism that doesn't involve new commitments, work for others, will melt away in the heat of the barbecue on the patio, the light of the TV, the warmth of the variety of all these different things, these choices are now available. And then she says, togetherness. All Jewish rivers run toward Israel. Zionism is then the yearning for the righting of a historical injustice, anti-Semitism, a response to the ever-presence of threat of anti-Semitism, but also there's still a mystical dimension to it. Now here, by the way, is where I disagree with Anne Royfee. One of the things I love about these texts, I said in my Zionist Ideas book, I had 168 texts. Anybody who reads them all and agrees with every single one of them isn't reading carefully. And so I can learn from Anne Royfee, partially by disagreeing, and we have to bring back the ethic of disagreement. And one of the themes of Never Alone is the power of the Jewish dialogue, where we learn to disagree amicably. Talmud, Teku. We learn to disagree vehemently, but also to learn from one another. And so I disagree with her that Zionism is so powerfully mystical that it's not a position for rational universalists. And I can quote Hess and Herzl almost a century before to say that. I don't think it requires unthinking commitment to one side, but I do think that what a beautiful, beautiful phrase. It grants the rewards of togetherness. That we were not raised to be alone. We were raised to connect. We were raised to be tribal. And that tribal can be negative, that tribal can be hostile, that tribal can be exclusive, or that tribal can be inclusive. And it can be that tribalism can be transcendent. And look, I put Ruth Gavison in conversation with Anne Roiphe. Anne Roiphe, an American feminist living in the Upper West Side. Ruth Gavison, Hebrew University law professor, proud feminist as well, leading jurist. And she's wary of a liberalism, of a humanism that ends up making people too thin. She says, I want us to be thick. We need affiliations. We need to connect. We need to have that sense of us, that sense of community, and that sense of sanctity to go beyond the sense of autonomy. And you know, those 10 commandments were very short and sweet. David Mamet, the crazy, brilliant American playwright, nails it. Real life consists in belonging. And he talks about it, not just in the context of his late discovery of being Jewish. He talks about the excitement of being on a movie set, the excitement of mounting a play. And this is, I think, very relevant to life today in isolation. He says, there's something missing when you're just alone. There's something missing when you're just isolated. Real life consists in belonging, in connecting. And Anita Shapira, the great Tel Aviv-based. And yes, I'm purposely finding people from different corners of the world, different walks of life, different worldviews. So the leading historian of Zionism talks about Zionism always focusing on the collective. The sense of national redemption would also promote personal redemption. And she wants, look again, that key word from Anne Roiphe, that sense of togetherness. That was the cohesive power and gift of Zionism. And David Ben-Gurion reminds us that it's not just for the us, it's not just for the I, but it's also for the other. And he says, who are we? We're an Muscular. And he said in an earlier part of this text, he goes, I don't really have a good English translation, and his English was excellent. He'd spent time in America. What is an Muscular? Chosen people. Treasured
people.
Treasured people, a treasured nation, right? But he doesn't even like that. He says it's not, but what does it mean? It means that I want to have a sense of an extra responsibility. And that extra responsibility is a virtue born of conscience and what Eliyahu called that still small voice. And look, he says, I'm the proud secularist. But I worry about our spiritual state. You cannot reach that higher virtue without being an idealist. And the late Shimon Peres called this the perpetual Jewish dissatisfaction gene. And David Ben-Gurion calls it the idealists, which makes me so glad to belong to this people and to be shared in their noble epic. Again, cleansing breath, open for any questions, comments. We're moving along to our next. Now, most of these texts have been from what we call secular thinkers, right? And again, you'll see one of the things I'm trying to do is break down those boundaries, break down those walls. And I think a person who really pulls this all together, and notice also I've picked from different periods of the Zionist conversation, the Zionist ideas, is Rav Kook. And look at the dimensionality of Rav Kook's Song of the Self. And think about the relationship between Rav Kook's Song of the Self and Richard Schwader's autonomy, community, sanctity. That let Jonathan Haidt realize, you know what? As a liberal atheist, I'm missing something. I need to appreciate community. I need to appreciate sanctity. And that's why he wrote The Righteous Mind. So Kook says, yeah, there's someone who just sings the song of self. He finds everything within himself. Complete spiritual satisfaction. I have to apologize, the gender neutral language hadn't hit Rav Kook and hadn't hit Moses Hess and hadn't hit Theodor Herzl. And there's a person who sings the song of the nation. He steps out of his private self, which he finds so narrow and insufficiently developed, and he clings with a sensitive love to the entirety of the nation and sings with it its song. He shares in its pain, its joyful sorrow, and speaks with exalted and pure thoughts regarding its past and its inner spiritual nature with love and a wise heart. So we have the ani, the self. We have the the nation. And then you also go beyond that. to sing the song of humanity. And with this, the song constantly grows broader. Humanity is glorious image. He yearns for humanity's general elements. He looks forward to supernatural perfection. From this source of life comes his thoughts, his insights, his ideals and visions. You see what's going on here? Theodor Herzl these days is often just told as the song of the self, that he was just protecting himself. He was just disappointed. This man with this beautiful black beard, this cultured European who wanted to be accepted. And when he could see that he was just a Jew in their eyes, he ran away. So it's just about the self. No, that doesn't really understand Theodor Herzl. And so they say, well, no, okay, but maybe it was just of the nation. That it was just this defensive Jew. We are a people. But no, it was defending the self. It was building the nation. But it was also, as we saw, for the song of humanity, to think of all others. And then the person who goes even higher and higher, unites with all existence and with all worlds, and with all them he sings, this is the person who is engaged in every day, is assured that he's a child of the world to come. And so what Rav Kook is calling for, and what I'm calling for, and what Tom Sharansky is calling for, is an ensemble. We have to be willing to make links here and there. And look at, again, Eitan's opening about the powerful Yom Ha'atzmaut ceremony and the powerful experiences we're seeing. Anybody who walks into an Israeli hospital these days is, the chances are, being served and helped by Arab nurses and by Arab doctors. And anyone who jogs, as I do when I'm allowed to, along the Park HaMesilah in Jerusalem, passes Arabs and Jews all dressed out in the Republic of Sport, trying to work off a couple of pounds, sharing a common language, sharing common experiences. Does this mean that Israel's perfect? Does it mean that we don't have to do a lot more work in terms of reaching out to our Israeli Arab brothers and sisters and making sure they feel like full citizenship? Of course not. No country is perfect. But this is a vision, and there are moments of success that we should also celebrate. The song of the soul, the song of the nation, the song of humanity. In the world, they all mix together with this person at every moment. And is it confusing? Yes. Is it sometimes paradoxical? Yes. But is it also rich and inspiring and enduring? Absolutely. My late mother warned, don't be so open-minded your brains fall out. You have to be willing to the best way to be a universalist, we learn from Sharansky, we learn from Mandela, we learn from Rav Kook, we learn from Anne Roifi, we learn from Ruth Gavison, is to be rooted in who you are and proud of who you are. Gilad Troyansky and Gil Troy balancing together. I want to stop because I think there's a question or a comment, Eitan.
I have a question. Was Rav Kook reading Walt Whitman?
It's right. It's the song of the self. It's very possible. I have not looked into the origins, but there's a, one of the things that's exciting to me about these texts is there's a commonality. You know, I always like to talk about the people want American and Israeli nationalism and the American and Israeli democracies to be twins. And I say they're sisters, not twins. They're siblings. And they learn from one another and they can build off one another. And when you see these kind of Vulcan mind melds, you see where there are so many common themes and so many common connections. In the two books that I've read about Rav Kook, I couldn't find any Walt Whitmanism, but you're right, there's that totally thing, the body electric. And that's but there's an excitement about 19th century nationalism. There's an excitement and this dance between nationalism, particularism, and universalism that is rooted, of course, in centuries before, but that really you feel very intensely. But I love this notion. I actually steal this from you of Rav Kook as the Walt Whitman of Israeli Zionism, not just a religious Zionist, but also truly, truly a Walt Whitman Zionist. I like to call myself a Fitzgeraldian Zionist, because F. Scott Fitzgerald said that the mark of a true intelligence is the ability to hold two contradictory thoughts simultaneously. And our ability to be universalist and particularist, our ability to be very, very, very proud of Israel and also very, very critical of Israel, our ability to yearn and also be satisfied, is that Fitzgeraldian concept. I like to call myself an Ed Kochian Zionist, because and an Ed Kochian American political historian, because Ed Koch taught us when he was running for governor. He was, of course, the famous mayor of New York, but he had an unsuccessful campaign for governor, but a great line during it where he said, if you agree with me on 7 of 12 things, please vote for me. If you agree with me on 12 of 12 things, please see a psychiatrist. And this notion in the modern world that we have to buy in to everything Donald Trump says, or everything Hillary Clinton says, or everything Joe Biden says, or reject everything they say, is a form of insanity. And now I'll also call myself and call Rav Kook Whitmanian Zionists. So thank you for that. Other comments, questions?
Please unmute yourself and feel free. Gil, maybe if you bring down the PowerPoint, then we can all see each other better, or there'll be more people on. Comments, questions?
The sound disappeared.
No, we're still here. We're just
I see. Eitan, why don't you read any of the 7 chats, see if there's anything there?
okay. Let me see.
And we'll have time for a finale if we don't have other questions.
Okay, a question. A few. Who is the Jewish audience for Never Alone? Jews in the diaspora or Jews in Israel? Wouldn't these lessons be very challenging to Jews in the diaspora? And I want to add to that, is it a young audience you're aiming for, an older audience? Who are you looking for when you and Natan were thinking out this book together?
Thank you for that. So the answer, of course, is yes, because every author wants everybody to read every word he or she has ever written. But no, we are really trying to find a language that works for our younger audience in the United States, our college students. The first part of the book, I said 999, really retells the story of the Soviet Jewish movement and of his time in prison. And one of the ghosts we had as we were writing was the ghost of that classic that he wrote, Fear No Evil, as soon as he left the Gulag. But Fear No Evil is, I'm just seeing if it's by my side, it's over 500 pages. It intimidated Nelson Mandela. And so the chances of younger people reading that are quite slim. We invite them to read that for a fuller look. But in 100, 110 pages now, you can get a sense of that movement. And by the way, shame on all of us. I'm sure many of the people on this call were some of the heroes of the Soviet Jewish movement. I'm sure so many of you marched, donated, sang, gave, braceleted. Some of you may have gone to the Soviet Union as I did in 1985. And not enough of us has told those stories to our kids and our grandkids. We were part of one of the great miracles of Jewish history. The great miracles, I didn't have to say of modern Jewish history, of Jewish history. And we have not told the story. And the book is partially a challenge to the older people to start triggering those conversations, but also to the younger people to say, you know what? This isn't ancient history. This happened 20, 30, 40 years ago. And we were quibbling then. We were quibbling then. We were arguing then. But yet we also knew how to keep our eye on the prize and remember that we're never alone. So our ideal target is younger Jews, and frankly, in the age of Trumpian polarization, in the age of coronavirus isolation, also non-Jews. We tried to write the book with an ear for a non-Jewish audience as well, who could just read one of the great stories of the 20th century, one of the great heroes of the 20th century, and learn, because one of the things that I fear as an American historian is how alienated, how lonely, how lost so many of my delicious college students are. I love them. And I learned so much from them. And I'm not one of those guys who says, oh, students aren't as good as they were 10, 20, 30 years ago. They're as smart, they're as idealistic. But one thing I do see is I see a loss. I see a loss of connectedness. I see how many of them work so hard to have the perfect CV and the ideal sky-high GPA and write those insane essays about how I'm a master of the universe and I should be accepted, and if this university doesn't accept me, the whole world is going to fall apart. And they get to university and they register for courses, these days online, and then they go straight to the psychiatric services for help. Because so many of them don't have that inner, what I call, we have to have, I call this kind of Pilates Judaism, Pilates Zionism, and Pilates humanism. We need to strengthen the core. And I don't mean to disrespect anyone who seeks out help, because of course, this generation is so much better at seeking out help than my generation was. But why are so many in such distress? What is going on? It's not just because they've been under pressure to perform. It's because they do feel alone. And we're trying to model the story of the Jewish people and Jewish activism and Jewish connectedness as a gift to the Western world, saying, you too have to find models for this.
So another comment, maybe from, so if the purpose is to give voice to those of us who worked with the SSJ and in the Soviet Jewry movement, will there be a version that gives voice to Ethiopian Operation Moses and Solomon? These are the stories of our generation. The question is how to convey them, how to tell the story.
You know, there's a whole story of the privilege, the honor of sitting with Natan Sharansky across from the table. The guy who was on my bracelet, the guy who, like so many of you, I marched for, but never really believed that he would get out because of our efforts, let's be honest. He believed it, but we didn't. I certainly didn't. And he's had just this extraordinary life. And one of my favorite parts of the book is we tell the story of Natan, who by this time, when Avital left 12 years before he did, they were married, and a day later she got a visa, and she left for Jerusalem. They had this big debate, but he didn't turn down visas at that moment. And she became more dati, more religious. And when he came to Israel in 1986, he started going down that path. And one day he comes to her and he says, look, we have to have Shabbat early because I'm going to fly to Ethiopia tonight. And she goes, well, pikuach nefesh, it's okay. And he goes, well, actually, and then it turns out, because she overhears the conversation before Shabbat, that he's not going to actually help the Ethiopians, but he's going as a journalist. She goes, journalists? That's not essential, right? That's not the language used, but I'm coping with the fact these days that I'm not an essential worker. But she goes, that's not pikuach nefesh. So Natan Sharansky calls up the head of the Jewish agency, who's is in the middle of organizing the operation to get out, 13,895 or something, that number, Ethiopian Jews in a day and a half during the Civil War. And he says, I need you to hire me as a flight attendant. And he goes, Natan, I'm crazy, busy. What are you doing? This Mendel Kaplan. And Natan goes as a flight attendant. Then he is an essential worker. And then it can be pikuach nefesh. And so Natan Sharansky, just a few short years after having been liberated himself, flies to Ethiopia and flies back serving. And you can only imagine how this guy shticked it up, giving food and giving water and singing with them and dancing with them and hugging them. And he tells the story, and he tells it, I guess we tell it, through the lens of him recreating his exodus, and the feelings are still so fresh. So indeed, we tell that story, and then we also tell the more complicated story afterwards of how many more Ethiopian Jews, how many more, the complexity of their integration. But there also is an extraordinary story of Israel diaspora cooperation, American Jews and Israelis working together to move mountains, to stop civil wars, to save Jewish souls. And of course, let's point out, to be the only country in the world that has willingly, voluntarily brought in Black Africans and lovingly embraced them, even with all our failures there too. So yes, thank you. It's definitely part of the book, which is indeed coming soon to a bookstore near you and to Amazon September 1st, not too early to pre-order.
Gil, thank you. This was, are there any more questions?
Yes, I have a question. So who thought that a journalist is not an essential worker? I mean, were they aware of the Vietnam War?
Yeah, that's the no. That was the internal dynamic between Avital and Natan. She deemed him not essential. She said it's not pikuach nefesh. She says because she knew he was just going, So
to write about how does Jews being saved from an
but in fact,
autocracy.
He was going, and he actually ended up writing this very powerful cover story for the Jerusalem Report, and also it was covered in the New York Times, and he was one of the voices. And in the book, we also have a lovely picture of him on the plane on the way home. So indeed, we do point out, it's kind of tongue in cheek, how essential it was. But it actually goes back to the opening theme of this phone call, that we're all deemed. I know I'm deemed as a mere professor non-essential, but we see how important the work that Eitan does, the work that the Schechter Institutes do, the work the continuing active normal and abnormal during this crazy time is so important. So I certainly didn't mean to disrespect journalists or professors. It's more my self-deprecating humor.
If I can ask a question, Gil, it's Vernon. Good to see you.
Hey, Vernon, how are you? Nice to see you.
Thank God. I agree with you that the particular leads to the universal. I've written and use Cynthia Ozick's example, that if you blow out of a shofar, you have to use the narrow end to hear the sound, because if you blow out the wide end, you won't hear any sound. But the question becomes, what happens if there is a conflict between the particular and the universal? There's tension. How does one make that decision? And I'm going to suggest that, for instance, you have issues related today with COVID and everything else, where people are giving tzedakah money. Rambam says, Aniyeh ircha kodmim, you should give first to your own poor people. People are going to have to decide where to give their tzedakah money. How are they going to deal with these kinds of things when there may be some real tension between the two?
Thank you for that. So, look, this goes back to my Fitzgeraldian Zionism, that one of the toxic things going on in our world today is the fear of tension, the fear of creative tension, the fear that if we don't go to one extreme or another, we're somehow betraying ourselves. And I think one of the arguments we're trying to make, and I know you've made it in so many different ways over the years of your extraordinary career, that the balance, in the balance, even if we don't have a simple formula for it, in the balance and in the process is a certain power. And that's the story of the Soviet Jewish movement. It's the story indeed of tzedakah now during the COVID crisis, and it's indeed the story of Israel. So we don't give formulas. We don't give formulas. We don't give easy answers. But the simple fact of asking the question and of trying to find a balance, and also fearing the extremes rather than embracing the extremes. I think today, and this is part of what I call Twitter dumb, D-U-M-B. The extreme voices dominate. And I think one of the things we learned, by the way, from the Democratic primary is that there still is a big gap between Main Street and Twitter dumb and what the media sees. So the media sits there often and reports what's going on in Twitter dumb, which brings out the voices of the far right and the far left. But most Americans and most Israelis and most Jews are still trying to do some kind of balance. And the best example of it is on the fight of anti-Semitism, with anti-Semitism today. The most annoying, the most outrageous, the most narrow-minded and ridiculous argument in the Jewish world today, which has been somewhat distracted because of the coronavirus, but was certainly at its peak in January and February before the virus hit, was the notion of which is worse, left-wing anti-Semitism or right-wing anti-Semitism. I can't think of a more intellectually disreputable debate. And what happens? My friends from the left only see right-wing anti-Semitism and yell and scream about right-wing anti-Semitism and are blind to some of the anti-Semitism we see on campus. And my friends on the right only see campus anti-Semitism, only see left-wing anti-Semitism, and are blind to the right-wing anti-Semitism we see in Richard Spencer and in some of the forces that support Trump. When in fact, we need two things. One is we need right and left to unite and have clear red lines. And I need my left-wing friends fighting left-wing anti-Semitism because they have the street cred there. And I need my right-wing friends fighting right-wing anti-Semitism because they have the street cred there. And so that's really the model answer to your very important and profound question, which is that by rejecting both extremes, by rejecting illiberal liberalism and rejecting hyper-nationalist nationalism, and by accepting the fact that we're going to come out with an imperfect balance, but trying to mobilize the forces within that can be constructive is the way forward. And unfortunately, in today's world, simply calling for that centrism, calling what I call for that muscular moderation, that balance, often makes you either mocked or ignored. And so what we're trying to do, frankly, is leverage the extraordinary story of Natan Sharansky and his extraordinary heroism to articulate a muscular moderation, a proud centrism, a balance that says you may not get it right, but at least if you're asking the question and you're seeing that it's a conflict, it's better than going all or nothing, one extreme or another.
You haven't addressed the issue of gender bias in Israel and in Judaism. That's one of the major turnoffs for a lot of young people in connecting to Judaism and Israel, is that they see that the practice of Judaism is dominated by persons who believe that there's something. They don't even read the Tanakh properly. They believe that there's something wrong with Kol Isha. Some of the prayer leaders in the Tanakh are women. So, and they don't read certain passages, or they don't read them properly, or they avoid them. So why has this very very, I would say, distorted understanding of sacred Judaism dominated to such an extent without a challenge and without an appropriate challenge rooted in halakha and rooted in Tanakh?
Thank you for that.
Yeah.
So
I could go on, but you got it.
So I'll veer in a way that'll make you happy, and I'll veer in a way that'll make you less happy. The way that will make you happy is that
my personal happiness is not the issue.
No, I know. I'm being glib. Those of you who know Natan's work in the Jewish Agency know that that part of the book is also going to be in the third 9, the Jewish Agency part. He spends a lot of time trying to find a golden path on the question of the Kotel and the question of women on the wall, and making sure that the wall is not a symbol of division, not a symbol of negativity, not a symbol for young women and young men saying you don't belong, but it is a wall for all people. And he shares his frustration with his friend of 30 years, Bibi Netanyahu, who betrayed him and betrayed so many of us after the many years that Netanyahu himself had invested in the process that Natan led of trying to find a constructive compromise. So there, I think one would definitely see Natan's desire and our desire to make sure that the issues of gender bias don't become a turnoff, but become a yet another way into the conversation. So that's, I think, where that issue comes out very strongly.
Yesh takana la'asata. Yesh takana.
Yeah, but now here's
because it's not the right answer. Excuse me for, I don't mean to interrupt, but I just don't. I think that the correct answer is not a constructive compromise. It's halakha itself. The right of women are not abrogated in the Tanakh, and they are in rabbinic Judaism.
Okay, but now here's where I get a little controversial and maybe a little mischievous, and I'll speak for myself. I don't want to speak for Natan, but I think we're on the same page. What does pluralism mean? Doesn't pluralism mean that I not only have to acknowledge the validity of Reform Judaism and Reconstructive Judaism, Reconstructionist Judaism, and the validity of women on the wall, but also my ultra-Orthodox brothers and sisters? And even though I may disagree, and you may disagree with their reading, and even though I may not live their life, if we're really going to talk about pluralism, if we're really going to talk about tolerance, if we're really going to talk about a big tent, I have to stretch a little bit and include them too. And so while I may disagree vehemently with their decisions and their opinions vis-a-vis the draft, vis-a-vis women, vis-a-vis the wall, I still have to, and this is one of the extraordinary things about the Soviet Jewish movement, was that we created a broad enough umbrella for ultra-Orthodox to be involved, except for the true extremists, for communists to be involved. French communists were involved, except for the true extremists. And so a true pluralism,
Yeah, but what did you
requires us all to stretch and us all to challenge one another and ourselves and our own unwillingness to truly accept the other. And look, I'll put it through the negative and then see the positive. The fact that ultra-Orthodox Jews, sometimes in their behavior, let's say around the coronavirus, make us cringe. And they make us cringe in a way that the behavior of Syrian thugs doesn't make us cringe. Shows we still had that sense of connectedness. And now I'm quoting, or I'm applying the teachings of Michael Sandel of Harvard, who says that shame is an expression of affiliation. And the fact that they somehow implicate us now, I'm not going to go down Mayor de Blasio's way and say, you know, you people, the Jewish community, but the connectedness is there, both, and now I'm going to quote Rav Soloveitchik, you know, that we're a community of faith, we're a machaneh, and we're also an edah. So the others define us as being connected, but we define each other as being connected. And is it easy? Again, it goes back to Rabbi Kurtz's important question. Is it easy to figure out how to balance that? No, but is it important for us to necessarily try and to stretch? And both in Natan's years in the Knesset and in the Jewish Agency, did he really try to figure out how to have as big a tent as possible, but that also had red lines, but also I like to call them blue and white lines, things on which we agree, not just things on which we agree to disagree. And that's the challenge. So I think that, did we always get it right? No, but is it important for us to understand the importance? And look, when I speak to, and I get this question too from university students. In fact, I was just on a Zoom call the other day, and someone called themselves an Israel critic. Said, I'm an Israel critic. And I said, that's fascinating. Would you call yourself an American critic? I said, I'm critical of Israel too, because how could I be a thoughtful patriot without having criticisms? But one of the arguments in the book is that we all too often have a tendency to only define Israel from the right as perfect and from the left as totally flawed. And just as with the anti-Semitism argument, I need thoughtful patriots from the left. I need thoughtful critics from the right. I need critical patriots and patriotic critics. And when people are too quick to dismiss Israel because it fails one test, I go, very interesting. I call this the Trumpertunity. Right now, Donald Trump has taught us an amazing thing. Again, we go to 80% of the Jewish community that abhors Donald Trump, that detests Donald Trump. But I checked the figures. They're not moving to Canada, and they're not moving to Israel. What is the resistance? The resistance is saying, I'm going to double down and fight against the Trump presidency because Trump isn't America. And even though there are many Americans who support Trump, my patriotic duty is to fight back against him and not let him define America. And yet all too often what happens is those same people who can make the distinction between their disdain for the president of the United States and disdain for his policies and their love of their country, when it comes to Israel, they put Israel on probation. And because they dislike the prime minister, or they dislike the occupation, I'm not afraid of that word, or they dislike what's going on with gender, they therefore give up on the whole enterprise. The Fitzgeraldian Zionist, the Kachian Zionist, and the Walt Whitmanist Zionist will say, no, we're multidimensional. There are things I love and things that I need to change. And if those of us who are committed to trying to fix things just give up, we're lost. But those of us who are critical patriots, who have things we want to fix, but also can see the things that we love, join together, we can do wonders.
This is the quest for a more perfect union.
Amen. Yeah. This is where I always say, I don't understand how I could be, how you can be a Zionist without being a historian, and how you can be an American without being a historian. Like the two meld. Again, they're not equal. They're not the same. They're not equivalent. They're siblings, but there is an Americanism and a Zionism that overlap. And as someone who's paid taxes in the United States, in Israel, and in Canada, Canada is really about peace, order, and good government. And it's a much
It is.
it's a much more static form of nationalism. I'm sorry, I see our good friend Charles Silva on the line, but it's, you know, that's the joy of Canada, and that's the limitation of Canada. But the beauty of American nationalism and of Jewish nationalism, i.e. Zionism, is it's more aspirational. And that means that it falls short more because it's stretching higher. And the frustrations sometimes grow more because there's also a sense sometimes of looking at oneself and trying to be better. But I like that dynamism. I like our failures. We need to have constructive failures just like we need constructive nationalism.
Gil, I think this was wonderful. I just want to say that, you know, we always see ourselves as kind of the center, the middle ground. It's supposed to be thoughtful and rational, but you also prove once again that the center has to be passionate. It has to approach its centrism in a most passionate and committed and convincing way. And this is, you know, we sit in a world that there's a right and there's a left, and you've given us an opportunity to also wield the passion of a center, of a Zionist, Jewish Zionist center. And I think that's what we represent at Schechter. I think that our pluralism is a pluralism that creates an environment where dialogue between different sectors builds itself into a community that can relate to each other, that can understand the importance of what unites us, as well as and appreciate what divides us. And I think that you've done that so beautifully tonight and represented that beautifully for all of us. And I thank all of you who've joined us this evening in this salon, and invite you again. Maybe we'll do this again. But in terms of this series, we will continue next week, same time, 7 p.m. In Israel, noon on the East Coast of the US, 5 p.m. in England, and 9 a.m. on the West Coast. And wherever you might live in between, you're welcome to join us. And also to join us for our other opportunities for education, our courses, our learning. And that's our passion. So thank you very much for joining us this evening. And I see you all young, not so young, students, board members, and good friends. Thank you for joining us this evening and this afternoon and this morning, wherever you are. Stay healthy and stay connected.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thanks for all your great ideas.
Thank you. Thank you. Right. Are you in McGill or in Israel?
I'm in Jerusalem.
Jerusalem. Which is your email? Is it the McGill University one?
I know, but giltroy@gmail.com
Mm-hmm.
is best, and I'm happy to continue the conversation.
Sure.
So thank you.
Okay.
Thank you.
Good evening. Take care. Bye-bye.